chaos erupted when my stepdad, Lloyd, grabbed my hand on the roof, the eclipse darkening everything but us. I was fiddling with the telescope. He brought coffee, then it hit, electric, wrong. Mom slept below, oblivious, as stars faded and tension flared. Half a year of sneaky vibes exploded, wild, unstoppable. I was up on the roof of our house in Albuquerque, New Mexico, wrestling with the tripod of my telescope, trying to get it steady for the solar eclipse that was due any minute. The sky was already dimming, a weird orange glow creeping in, and I'd been at it for an hour, my hands smudged with grease from the mount. Mom was downstairs, crashed out after her night shift at the library, dead to the world, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then the trapdoor squeaked, and my stepdad, Lloyd, a 57-year-old clock repair guy who dabbled in stargazing, climbed up, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He set it down on the ledge, said I looked like I could use it, and crouched next to me, his flannel brushing my arm as he checked the lens alignment. I grabbed the mug, took a sip, and said thanks, keeping my eyes on the scope, but he didn't move, just stayed there, close, watching me tweak the focus. The air felt thick, not just from the eclipse, and I asked if he was gonna help or just stare. He laughed, said he'd help, and reached over to adjust the eyepiece, his hand sliding over mine, warm, steady. I froze, the coffee bitter on my tongue, and he didn't pull back, his fingers lingering, pressing just enough to make my pulse jump. I looked up, caught his eyes, dark under the fading light, and said he didn't have to stay so close. He smirked, said he didn't mind, and shifted nearer, his knee bumping mine. The sky went darker, the eclipse kicking in, and I should have been watching the sun, but I couldn't look away from him. He said something about the stars coming out soon, his voice low, and I shot back that we weren't here for stars yet. Why was he really up here? He leaned in, his hand still on mine, and said he figured I'd want company. I'd been up here alone too long. I pulled my hand free, slow, and adjusted the scope myself, saying I could handle it, but my heart was hammering, and he didn't budge, just watched, too still. Hey, you all out there, ever feel something shift when it shouldn't? That's where I was, stuck in it. I stood, stepped to the ledge, pretending to check the horizon, but he followed, standing behind me, close enough I could feel his breath on my neck. He said the eclipse was perfect from here, his hand brushing my arm again, deliberate now, and I turned, facing him, saying he was missing it. He wasn't even looking up. He grinned, said he saw plenty, and I stepped back, my heel hitting the telescope stand, rattling it. The moment hung, heavy, and I knew I had to break it. I muttered something about needing water, climbed down the trapdoor fast, and bolted to my room, shutting the door tight. I stood there, hands shaking, hearing him move around up top, probably sipping that damn coffee. The eclipse was peeking outside, but I wasn't going back, not yet. Whatever that was, it wasn't just about stars, and I'd felt it hit harder than the darkness swallowing the sky. I woke up late the next morning, the house still quiet, Mom already gone to the library for her day shift, leaving me and Lloyd alone again. I dragged myself downstairs, still rattled from the roof, and found him in his workshop off the dining room, hunched over a workbench littered with gears and tiny screwdrivers. He was fixing an old pocket watch, his glasses perched on his nose, the tick of a dozen clocks filling the space like a heartbeat. I leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him twist a spring into place, and he didn't look up, just said he'd heard me come down, asked if I slept okay after the eclipse. I stepped in, grabbed a stool, and sat across from him, saying I'd slept fine. How about him? He set the watch down, pushed his glasses up, and said he'd stayed up late, thinking about the sky. His eyes flicked to me, quick, then back to the gears. I smirked, picked up a tiny wrench from the bench, twirling it, and said the sky wasn't the only thing up there worth noticing. He'd been pretty hands-on. He coughed, grabbed a cloth to wipe his hands, and said I'd been the one fiddling with that scope. He was just helping. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bench, and told him his help felt more like hovering. Did he enjoy it? He shifted, his knee brushing the table leg, and said I'd kept him up there longer than he planned. Guess I was good company. I tossed the wrench down, stood, and walked around to his side, leaning against the bench next to him, close enough my hip bumped his arm. I said maybe he liked my company too much. His hand had stuck around longer than the coffee. He turned to facing me, and reached for a gear, his fingers grazing mine as he took it, slow, deliberate. I didn't pull back, just watched him, and he said I was reading too much into it. Eclipses mess with people. I laughed, soft, and said it wasn't the eclipse messing with me, maybe he felt it too. His hand paused, hovering over the watch, and he looked up, his face closer now, the air tight between us. I pushed it, sliding my hand along the bench, brushing his wrist, and asked if he'd thought about coming up to the roof again, stars or not. He gripped the gear, set it down hard, and said I was making this complicated. I shot back that he'd started it, staying so close. He stood, towering over me, and said I didn't get how tricky this could get. His voice was low, shaky. I stepped in, my shoulder against his chest, and told him tricky could be fun. He hadn't walked away yet. His hand twitched, like he might grab me, but he shoved it in his pocket, staring down at me, caught. Then the doorbell rang. Delivery guy with a package of clock parts Lloyd had ordered. I stepped back, said I'd get it, and bolted to the front door, signing for it quick while the guy rambled about shipping delays. I carried the box back, dropped it on the bench, and said he owed me for saving him from small talk. He took it, his fingers brushing mine again, and muttered that I was too quick. I grinned, said he'd better keep up, and walked out to the kitchen, starting pancakes like nothing happened. I heard him tinkering again, the clink of metal sharp, and knew I'd left him spinning, right where I wanted him. By afternoon, the sun was high, and I was out on the back patio, slapping paint on an old wooden bench we'd dragged from the shed, the air thick with the smell of latex and dust. Mom was still at the library, buried in books, and Lloyd wandered out, a can of iced tea in hand, saying he'd check my work, didn't trust me with a brush. I dipped it in the can, flicked a streak of white across the wood, and said he could grab a brush or keep critiquing. He set the tea down, picked up a spare, and started on the other end, his strokes slow, precise. I watched him, the way his flannel stretched over his shoulders, and said he looked too serious, needed to loosen up. He smirked, said I was the one making a mess, and kept painting, his elbow brushing the bench edge near mine. I dipped my brush again, leaned over, and swiped a streak across his fingers, quick, deliberate, paint smeared over his knuckles, and he jerked back, staring at it, then at me. I laughed, said oops, and he grabbed his brush, flicked a dab back at my arm, saying I'd started a war now. I stood, stepped closer, and smeared another streak on his wrist, my fingers lingering on his skin, warm under the paint. He didn't pull away, just looked at me, his brush hovering, and said I was asking for trouble. I grinned, said trouble was my specialty. I sat back on the bench, still wet with paint, and patted the spot next to me, saying he could finish it sitting. He didn't, just stepped closer, his knee bumping mine, and kept painting, his hand steady but his eyes on me. I reached over, grabbed his tea, took a sip, and handed it back, my fingers brushing his, slow, teasing. He took it, his grip tight, and said I was pushing buttons again. I leaned in, my shoulder against his arm, and told him he liked the buttons. Why else was he out here? He set the can down, his hand brushing my leg as he pulled back, and said I was making it hard to focus. I shot back that focus was overrated. The air got heavy, the paint fumes mixing with something else, and I swiped my brush again, this time along his sleeve, leaving a white stripe. He grabbed my wrist, light but firm, and said I'd regret that. I twisted free, stepped into him, my chest grazing his, and said I hadn't regretted anything yet, had he? His hand dropped, hovering by my hip, and he didn't answer, just stood there, breathing hard, caught. I could have pushed more, but a kid's voice yelled from next door, some brat asking if we'd seen his ball, and I flinched, stepping back, paint dripping on my shoe. I grabbed my phone, cranked up some loud pop track from the speaker, and started swaying, brushing paint like it was a dance, saying we'd drown him out. Lloyd watched, brush in hand, and said I was nuts. I twirled, said nuts kept it fun, and kept moving, letting the music fill the gap. He went back to painting, but his eyes followed me, and I knew I'd rattled him again. I stayed out there, grooving until the bench was done, then left him with the mess, heading inside to wash up, the beat still thumping behind me. That evening, I was in the pantry off the kitchen, digging through shelves for a can of paint thinner to clean the brushes from earlier, the house quiet with Mom still at the library. Lloyd walked in, flipping the light switch, and asked what I was up to. I said I needed to finish the job, grabbed a can, and turned, bumping right into him in the tight space. He didn't step back, just stood there, his toolbox clanking as he set it on the counter, and said he'd help, didn't want me spilling it everywhere. I handed him the can, my arm brushing his chest, and said he could pour if he was so worried. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, and popped the lid with a screwdriver. I grabbed a rag, started wiping a brush, and said he'd been hovering a lot lately. Coincidence or what? He poured the thinner into a jar, steady, and said I kept giving him reasons to stick around, His voice was flat but sharp. I stepped closer, my shoulder pressing his, and said maybe I liked the company, he didn't have to keep finding excuses. He set the can down, turned, his elbow knocking mine, and said I was the one stirring things up. I smirked, said he wasn't stopping me. He grabbed another brush, started cleaning it, his hands quick, but I caught him glancing at me, too long, too often. I shifted, leaning against the shelf, my hip bumping his, and asked if he'd thought about the roof. Those stars weren't watching themselves. He scrubbed harder, said I was stuck on that night, and I grabbed his rag, wiping my hands slow, letting my fingers brush his wrist. He froze, looked at me, and said I was making this a habit. I stepped in, my chest an inch from his, and said habits weren't so bad. He was still here. He dropped the brush, his hand hovering near my arm, and said I didn't get how close this was getting. I laughed, said I got it fine. He just wasn't backing off. The space was tight, shelves digging into my back, and I turned it up, sliding my hand along the counter, brushing his, and said he could leave any time. He didn't, just stood there, his breath hitching. I leaned in, my shoulder pinning his arm, and said he liked this game, admit it. He gripped the jar, knuckles white, and said I was playing with fire. I shot back that he was holding the match. His hand twitched, almost grabbing me, but then his phone rang, Mom, asking if we'd seen her overdue book list. I stepped back, grabbed the thinner, and said I'd handle it, bolted to the backyard, leaving him in the pantry. I dumped the jar over the flower bed, soaking the dirt, while he answered her, voice muffled through the wall. I stayed out there, hosing off the brushes, hearing him hang up and shuffle back to his workshop. He didn't follow, but I knew I'd pushed him hard, and he wasn't running yet. The next afternoon, I dragged an old bike out to the shed behind the house, its chain rattling and tires flat from years of neglect. Mom was at the library, sorting returns, and I figured I'd kill time fixing it up. Lloyd showed up 10 minutes later, toolbox in hand, saying he'd heard me banging around, couldn't let me break something he'd have to fix later. I rolled my eyes, said I could handle it, and popped the kickstand, grabbing a wrench from the bench. He set his tools down, pulled up a stool, and said he'd supervise, didn't trust me with gears. I started loosening the chain, and he leaned in, pointing out a rusted link, his arm brushing mine as he took over the wrench. I let him, stepping back, and said he was awfully hands-on lately. Didn't he have clocks to fix? He twisted the chain free, dropped it on the bench, and said I kept pulling him away from them. His tone was sharp, but he didn't look away. I grabbed a rag, wiped my hands, and said maybe I was more interesting than gears. He smirked, said I was something, all right, and handed me a screwdriver to pop the tire off. I took it, my fingers grazing his, slow on purpose, and knelt by the wheel, feeling him watch me work. He stayed close, his knee near my shoulder, and said I wasn't half bad at this. I shot back that he wasn't half bad at hovering. I stood, grabbed a pump, and started on the tire, my elbow bumping his chest as I leaned over. He didn't move, just grabbed the pump's handle with me, his hand over mine, pushing down hard. I said he didn't have to hold so tight. He said I didn't have to move away, and I laughed, saying maybe he liked it. He was already in too deep. His grip stayed firm, and I twisted the pump, making it squeak, our hands locked together. He pulled back, grabbed a can of oil, and started lubing the chain while I kept pumping, the tire firming up fast. I leaned in, my shoulder pressing his arm, and said he was good at this. Did he practice on stars too? He wiped his hands, said I was the one keeping him busy, not the sky, and tossed me the oil can, his fingers brushing mine again. I caught it, stepped closer, and dribbled oil on the gears, letting my hip bump his thigh. He grabbed a rag, cleaned a spoke, and said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I smirked, said he wasn't complaining yet, and slid the chain back on, my hands guiding his to snap it into place. He pressed down, his arm against mine, and said I was too close. I stepped in more, my chest grazing his side, and said he could push me off any time. He didn't, just locked the chain, his breath quick, and I felt the heat off him, the shed shrinking around us. I grabbed a tire lever, started prying the rim, and asked if he'd thought about the roof lately. He'd been stuck on me up there. He took the lever, his hand over mine, and said I was stuck on it too. Why'd I keep bringing it up? I twisted it free, my elbow digging into his ribs, and said maybe I liked how he looked at me. He popped the tire off, set it down, and said I was fishing for trouble. I stood, leaned against the bench, my leg brushing his, and told him trouble found me. He was just along for the ride. He grabbed the pump again, started on the other tire, his knee pressing mine, and said I was steering this somewhere dumb. I laughed, said he was keeping up just fine. I slid behind him, reached for a spare tube, my chest brushing his back, and he stiffened, turning halfway, his hand landing on my arm, light but firm. He said I needed to quit, he couldn't think straight. I pressed closer, my hip against his, and said thinking's overrated, he liked this mess. He let go, grabbed the tube, and started fitting it, his hands shaky, my shoulders still on his. I took the pump, worked it with him, our hands tangled, and said he wasn't running, why not? He pushed down hard, said I was making it impossible, his voice cracked, and I bumped him harder, feeling him tense. The air was thick, tools clanking as we moved, and I grabbed the wrench again, tightening a bolt, my arm pinning his against the frame. He said my name, sharp, and I twisted the bolt, my chest full on his arm, saying he could say stop. He didn't, just held there, breathing fast. I dropped the wrench, slid my hand along his arm, and said he was in this now, admit it. He grabbed the tire, shoved it on, his fingers brushing my waist, and said I was crazy. I stepped in, my body flush with his side, and said crazy worked, he wasn't leaving. Then headlights swept through the shed window, a car rolling past slow on the street outside. I jumped back, grabbed the pump, and started working it hard, saying we'd been loud, hope they didn't stop. Lloyd stepped away, wiped his hands, and said that was too close. I smirked, kept pumping, and said he'd survived worse. He muttered something about me being a hazard, grabbed his toolbox, and stayed put, watching me finish the tire. I locked it in, stood, and said I'd take this thing for a spin, maybe he'd catch me later. I wheeled it out, hopped on, and pedaled to the roof access, shouting back for him to keep up if he dared. I hit the ladder, climbed fast, and started tweaking the telescope again, the bike propped below. He didn't follow, but I heard the shed door slam, his steps fading to the house. I stayed up there, adjusting the lens, knowing I'd left him spinning, and he wasn't done chasing yet. It was late that night, and I'd hauled an old star projector into the living room, plugging it in near the couch, its lights splashing dots across the walls. Mom was supposed to be at the library until dawn, and I was restless after the shed, needing something to do. Lloyd came downstairs, a water bottle in hand, wearing a loose shirt and jeans, and stopped when he saw me fiddling with the projector, adjusting the lens. He asked why I was still up. I said I wanted to see the stars inside, and waved him over, telling him to sit. He hesitated, set the bottle on the coffee table, and dropped onto the couch a cushion away, saying I was always up to something, he'd give me that. I shifted, kicking my legs up on the ottoman, my foot brushing his knee, and said he kept showing up for it, lucky me. He smirked, leaned back, his arm resting along the couch, and said I made it tough to stay away, I was a magnet for trouble. I turned the projector up, stars spinning slow, and slid closer, my elbow nudging his side, asking if he liked trouble that much. He didn't answer, just watched me, his hand near my shoulder, and I pushed it, swinging my legs down, sitting so my arm pressed his, saying he could join in any time, he wasn't just a bystander. He shifted, his leg bumping mine, and said I was running this show, he was just keeping up. I grabbed the remote, dimmed the stars a bit, and dropped it, my hand landing on the cushion near his, fingers brushing his jeans. He tensed, his hand sliding closer, grazing mine, and said I was at it again. I smirked, moved my hand up his arm, light, teasing, and said he'd started it on the roof, he hadn't stopped me since. His fingers curled on the couch, his other hand hovering by my elbow, and he said I was testing him too much. I leaned in, my shoulder against his chest, and told him he could fail the test any time. He didn't move, just sat there, caught. I turned, facing him, my knee sliding next to his, and rested my hands on the couch back, framing him, slow, deliberate. He said my name, quiet, edgy, and I shifted closer, my legs brushing his, saying he could walk away. He stayed put, his hands landing on the cushions near my hips, close but still. I rocked forward, my fingers tapping his shoulder, and he shifted, his arm pressing mine, pulling me nearer. I leaned back, hands still near him, and said he was into this, why pretend? He moved his hand, brushing my wrist, and I slid closer, my knee over his lap, saying he'd been waiting for this, he couldn't fake it. He stood, slow, and I followed, stepping in front of him, my hand on his arm, guiding him toward the wall. He went, his shoulder brushing mine, and I stopped him there, standing close, my chest an inch from his, saying he'd been hooked since the roof, admit it. He braced one hand on the wall, the other near my side, and said I was messing with him. I stepped in, my arm pinning his, and shot back that he was messing with himself, sticking around. His hand dropped, hovering by my hip, and I pressed closer, my fingers curling into his sleeve, feeling him tense. I tilted my head, my hair brushing his arm, and said he could leave. He didn't, just stood there, his hand sliding to the wall again, studying. I backed off, grabbed the remote, and turned the projector up, stars spinning wild, then sat back on the couch, patting the spot next to me. He followed, dropping down closer this time, his leg against mine, and said I was relentless. I laughed, said he liked relentless, and leaned into him, my shoulder digging into his. His hand rested on his knee, brushing mine, and I slid it closer, fingers grazing his, saying he wasn't fighting this, why not? He shifted, his arm along the couch back, near my neck, and said I was making it tough to think. I smirked, said thinking was his problem, not mine. I stood, stepped to the projector, tweaking it, and bent over, letting my shirt right up, knowing he was watching. He got up, walked over, standing behind me, his hand near the table, brushing my elbow as he reached for the water bottle. I turned, facing him, close, and said he didn't have to stay so near. He took a sip, set it down, his fingers grazing my arm, and said I didn't have to keep pulling him in. I stepped closer, my hip bumping his, and told him he wasn't pulling away either. He grabbed the remote, turned the stars down, and stood there, his shoulder against mine, saying I was driving this somewhere dumb. I laughed, said he was riding shotgun, and nudged him back to the couch. We sat, my leg over his knee, my hand on his arm, and I said he could end this game. He didn't, just shifted, his hand resting near my thigh, light, teasing. I leaned in, my chest brushing his arm, and said he was too into it now, he couldn't fake it. He moved his hand, brushing my wrist again, and I slid closer, my knee pressing his, saying he'd been waiting for this, he couldn't lie. His fingers tapped my arm, slow, and he said I was trouble. I grinned, said he liked trouble, and stayed there, the stars flickering above us, the room tight with it. Then the front door banged open. Home early, her purse hitting the floor, voice sharp, asking why the hell Lloyd was on the couch with me, stars spinning like some damn show. I jumped up, heart slamming, and he stood, knocking the remote off the table, stammering it was just the projector, nothing else. She stormed over, saw how close we'd been, and yelled he'd been sneaking around too long. She wasn't blind. I said it was my idea, but she turned on him, screaming he'd crossed a line. Get out, now. She was done. He grabbed his shoes, face pale, and she shoved him toward the door, shouting about trust and lies, her hands shaking. I stood there, frozen, as he stumbled out, the door slamming, her eyes cutting to me next. She said we'd deal with this tomorrow. I didn't argue, just nodded, knowing I'd lit the fuse. He was gone, and she wasn't letting it slide.